All right, let's get into a really big chapter in modern history. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It's a 10-year conflict from 1979 all the way to 1989.
A full decade.
hmm
And it's one of those events that, really reshaped the entire end of the 20th century.
Exactly. So for anyone studying this, our mission here is to understand how it started, why it dragged on for so long, and of course, the consequences for the whole world.
And you really can't understand it without looking at the bigger picture. In 1979, we are deep in the Cold War.
Which means the world was, for all intents and purposes, split into two teams. You have the United States on one side, pushing capitalism and democracy.
And on the other, the Soviet Union pushing communism, and they were in this huge global competition for influence,
They weren't fighting each other directly, but they were backing opposite sides everywhere else.
which is what made Afghanistan so important.
Eh.
If you just look at a map, it shares this huge border right along the southern part of the Soviet Union.
Their soft underbelly, so to speak.
Precisely. The Soviets could not accept a hostile or even a Western-friendly government right there in Kabul.
Hmm.
Having a friendly, socialist government was a matter of national security for them.
Okay, so they had the motive, but what was the immediate trigger? I mean, an invasion is a massive step. It couldn't have just happened overnight.
No, not at all. And what's so fascinating here is that the problems that led to the invasion, they actually started inside Afghanistan.
So it was an internal issue first.
Completely.
Hmm.
Back in 1978, a local communist party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, they took power in a coup.
And they were, I assume, heavily backed by Moscow.
Oh, absolutely. And they didn't waste any time. They started pushing for this extremely fast, forced modernization based on, strict communist ideas.
We're talking about huge changes to daily life, right?
Huge. For instance, they tried to change centuries-old laws about who owned land, and they passed new laws about marriage, restricting things like bride price. They even mandated education for women.
That last part sounds positive. But I'm guessing in a deeply traditional and religious country, that was seen as a huge overstep.
It was seen as a direct attack on their faith, on their culture. You had religious leaders, tribal elders, conservative families. They all saw this as the government trying to destroy their way of life.
So how did they respond?
With immediate and pretty overwhelming pushback, resistance movements started popping up all over the country, especially in the rural areas. These were the first seeds of the Mujahideen, the holy warriors.
And the Soviets are watching all this from next door. They see their new communist project basically falling apart.
They're watching it lose control of its own country. And worse, the Communist Party itself was a mess, full of infighting and purges. Moscow was getting very, very nervous.
Terrified, probably.
They were terrified the whole thing would fail, that their socialist government would collapse and be replaced by, say, an Islamic regime. That was just unacceptable to them during the Cold War. They decided it wouldn't work without their direct military help.
And that's the gamble they take. The invasion itself kicks off on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1979. Fast and hard.
It really was a shock and awe style of campaign. They flew thousands of troops directly into Kabul on these huge transport planes. At the same time, tanks were rolling right across the border.
And what was their immediate goal? Just to stabilize things.
Their main goal was actually very specific. They wanted to get rid of the Afghan leader at the time, Hafizullah Amin. They didn't trust him.
They thought he was talking to the West.
They suspected it, yeah. So they wanted him out and replaced with someone totally loyal to Moscow, a man named Babrak Karmal. Soviet special forces launched this incredibly brutal attack on the presidential palace to make it happen.
So they thought they could just swap out the leader, calm things down, and then leave.
That was the plan. A quick fix. They thought it would take a few weeks, a few months at most, and we seriously underestimated the Afghan people's reaction.
And that quick operation ended up being the start of a 10-year war. They basically walked right into their own version of Vietnam.
It's a perfect comparison. A high-tech superpower getting bogged down, fighting a low-tech insurgency. And a huge reason for that was the country itself.
The geography.
The geography. The terrain in Afghanistan was maybe their most unforgiving enemy. It's almost designed to defeat a big mechanized army. You've got the Hindu Kush Mountains. We're talking peaks over 20,000 feet high.
Not exactly tank country.
And not at all. It's all narrow passes and deep valleys.
Hmm.
So Soviet tanks, their trucks, they were stuck on the very few paved roads. They were predictable targets.
And the weather, I imagine.
Oh, the weather was extreme. Freezing cold and deep snow in the winter, then scorching hot and dusty in the summer. The land and the climate were just actively fighting them every single day.
Which, of course, gave a huge advantage to the local fighters, the Mujahideen. You said they weren't one single army.
Not at all. That's a key point. There were all these different groups, local tribes, religious factions, all highly motivated to protect their land and their faith from what they saw as a foreign atheist invasion.
A holy war.
For them, it was a jihad, and they fought using guerrilla warfare.
So more than just hit-and-run attacks, how did that actually work on the ground?
They used their knowledge of the terrain perfectly. They'd hide up in the mountains and wait for a Soviet supply convoy to come through a pass. A classic tactic was to use a rocket to hit the first vehicle and the last one.
Trapping the entire column.
Exactly. The convoy is stuck, can't move, and the Mujahideen would just fire down on them from positions the tanks couldn't even aim at. And then, before air support could show up, they'd just melt back into the mountains. The goal was attrition, to bleed the Soviet army one ambush at a time.
So the Soviets are stuck in this brutal struggle, and this is the point where the war stops being a local conflict and becomes a global chessboard. It becomes a proxy war.
That term is so crucial. A proxy war is when, two major powers, here the U.S. and the USSR, don't want to fight directly.
Because that's World War III.
Right. So instead, they support opposite sides in another country's war. They use proxies to do the fighting for them.
And the United States saw a chance here to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam.
A golden opportunity to bleed them dry without risking a single American soldier. The U.S. started pouring in millions of dollars in aid and military gear. Most of it was channeled through neighboring Pakistan.
And it wasn't just money and guns. There was one piece of technology that changed everything: the Stinger missile.
The Stinger was the absolute game changer. Before that, the Soviets owned the sky. Their Mi-24 Hind helicopters were these terrifying flying tanks. They could just wipe out Mujahideen positions from above. It was their biggest advantage.
But the Stinger is a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile.
Correct. A single person can use it. And suddenly, these local fighters could shoot down those helicopters and planes. The Soviet air advantage, their lifeline, it was gone. It was a massive psychological blow.
You're essentially handing a superpower's weapon to an insurgency.
It completely leveled the playing field in the air.
And while all this is happening, this geopolitical game, the actual cost for the people of Afghanistan was just devastating.
It's staggering to think about. The estimates are that around 1 million Afghan civilians died in that decade.
1 million people.
The Soviets often treated whole villages as enemy bases, leading to these scorched earth tactics, bombing raids.
And millions of people were forced from their homes.
Millions became refugees, mostly in Pakistan and Iran. Living in these massive camps, often without enough food, clean water, or medicine. It was a humanitarian catastrophe on an enormous scale.
And back inside the country, the infrastructure was just being torn apart.
Completely. Villages, farms, schools, all destroyed. And the fields were littered with landmines. There were these particularly vicious ones called butterfly mines, small plastic mines that look like toys.
So they were targeting children.
They caused horrific injuries to children. The entire fabric of the country was being ripped to shreds.
And yet, despite all this brutality and all their technology, the Soviets couldn't win. By the mid-1980s, the war was just a stalemate.
A total stalemate. They controlled the big cities and the main roads, but only during the day. They never, ever controlled the countryside. That belonged to the Mujahideen.
And this must have been causing a huge crisis back home in the Soviet Union.
A massive crisis. The war was unbelievably expensive, straining an already weak Soviet economy.
And what about public opinion?
Morale was collapsing. The public started hearing about the casualties, the thousands of young men coming home in coffins. The war became known as the bleeding wound.
A wound that was just draining the country's resources and its spirit.
Exactly. And that pressure led to a huge political change. In 1985, a new leader comes to power in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev.
And he was different, a reformer.
A total reformer. He knew the system was broken. He introduced two famous policies, glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring.
So with these new policies, was he basically admitting the war was a mistake?
In effect, yes. Gorbachev knew that to fix the Soviet economy and improve relations with the West, he had to end the war. He was the first leader to actively look for a way out.
And so the withdrawal finally began in May 1988, and it was finished by February 15th, 1989.
Right. There's that famous photo of the last Soviet soldier, General Boris Gromov, walking back across the Bridge of Friendship into Soviet territory. It was a powerful symbol of their defeat.
And the world saw it as a massive humiliation for a superpower.
It was. The war exhausted their economy, shattered their military's reputation, and it directly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself just a couple of years later.
But for Afghanistan, the end of the Soviet war didn't mean the beginning of peace.
Not at all. It led directly to a brutal civil war. All those different Mujahideen factions, who had only united to fight the Soviets, immediately turned on each other to fight for control.
Creating a power vacuum that allowed even more radical groups to rise later on.
Exactly. And the long-term scars are still there. Millions of unexploded landmines. And that global network of fighters who came to Afghanistan for the jihad, they took their experience and ideologies to other conflicts around the world for decades.
It's just a powerful lesson that even a superpower with all its technology can be defeated by determined local resistance and, well, impossible geography.
Absolutely. That decade-long war really did shape the fall of one empire and, at the same time, the future instability of an entire region.
A story that shows that sometimes mountains can beat tanks. Good luck with your studies.